I'm going to be sharing with you tonight for a few minutes work from a collective which is now called the Living Architecture Systems Group. And it is work that combines architecture and lightweight systems, distributed computation, synthetic biology, some strains of psychology, and some interdisciplinary working methods, spinning together in a rather hopeful endeavor in order to try to reconceive the way we might create emplacement. The possibility that we might contribute a kind of fertility to the world. Shifting rather resolutely from ways that we have been taught our traditions flow. The idea that the world is solid and that things need to be clear and bounded and efficient is such an extraordinarily ingrained series of ethics that it results in a set of form languages, things that stand on top, things that have minimum surfaces, things that have maximum amounts of territory. A whole cluster of classical idioms that has very serious consequences for how we relate to each other and how our world is constructed. I hope that this cluster of projects that I'm going to share with you might offer some alternative strategies that does justify a series of optimisms. I'm going to run very quickly through a series of projects to give a feeling for the kind of work that we've been doing as an offering, and then I'll make some comments on methods of design and structure, and I'm going to try to capture some sense of a relationship with environments that this contributes to as a series of strategies. The work that we have been gathering together might have as an example the rather symphonic work that was produced for the Canadian Pavilion in Venice. Multiple layers, hyperbolic scaffolds, distributed computation, synthetic biology woven in, and a turf-like amalgam weeds clothing the surface in order to search for a new kind of fabric for architecture that might weave around us. More recently in Seoul, we made quite a large bubbling container that was for gathering, and that had a synthetic biology, organic chemistries weaving through the center of the space and then reaching quite far out, making a kind of hovering weather. In light-filled installations, such as the one in the Calatrava Atrium in Toronto three years ago, we tried to gather much larger bodies of people in a rather resilient and very gentle kind of emplacement, very different than the kind of hard, vitrified environments that might characterize a subway station or a public square. And the gentleness that wove around the million strong people that came through here in the few days that it was up did justify a kind of optimism, because this kind of architecture behaved very, very well. It was tenacious, it stood up, it engendered a kind of stewardship and care that suggested that collective energy need not only be founded on security and on solid ground and on boundaries. Rather, a very careful kind of fragility might contribute to a social realm. In darker moments, we've also been trying to contribute some qualities of healing and of nurturing, such as this space, the Opern Werkstätten, which was the place where the Third Reich conceived of its mythologies in stage plays during the 30s, this great healing canopy. And this kind of rather visceral, turf-like construction characterizes the fabrics that we are currently working on. I wonder if you can see the different structures that are at work here. Quite a calm, simple geometry, tessellations of multiple structures that weave together in a flexible scaffold, and then distributed computational systems running through them that hold sensors and actuators, distributed intelligences founded in microprocessors, and then glass manifolds holding new kinds, very simple kinds, of chemical interactions that serve to renew and breathe and irradiate. Underlying those behaviors is a sense not so much of having things do our bidding and amplify our control, but rather to create a very gentle kind of ambience which creates breathing and outward rippling and response, engendering a sense, hopefully, of mutual relationships with the world. Sometimes, as we walk through these environments, sensors pick up our movements and sensations ripple out and rebound and create a kind of efflorescence. And some of the work becomes very happily ones of social display as well, in which we are able to create kind of possibility sheaths around our bodies as expanded physiologies. We're really very happy about some of the exposures, such as the distillation of this work into couture now. I was very proud to show this one to my mum. The question of how we might contribute is so founded on a sense of where we are collectively, where we are individually. Is it possible to say, as Vitruvius, the Roman writer who declared the ingredients of architecture 2,000 years ago, declared, that the world is strong and firm and eternal? Is it possible to conceive of a body of work that is bounded and guided by firmitas, the sense that we can create a kind of eternal, monumental solidity that guides us? Is it possible to believe that our parents will be with us forever, and that nature is whole and strong and eternally self-renewing, carrying us? I think it would be very foolish if I were to immediately step into the 20th century and declare that God is dead and that space is empty and that my parents are gone and that I can be proud about floating in an existential void. Because when I do stand on the ground, I do feel a certain solidity. I am carried. I do love my parents. I do walk in the woods, and I do feel somewhat carried. And yet, is it possible, when we think of what is coming, to have such a beautiful certainty? Is it possible to feel that the surface of the earth is bounded and whole and strong, and that life is before us, and that we will be carried because we are enmeshed in a great living, breathing whole? I cannot honestly feel carried this way, and I wonder how you feel about that question. Nor can I be proud in a kind of a cynicism of certainty that I need to replace the world with a new synthetic bubble and float away and celebrate in our own artifice instead of the erased world. But somehow the question of our fundament has arisen in such a way as to leave us almost speechless about the future. I think it would be very understandable if a careful architecture student facing the future would respond with the wish to tighten down their boundaries and to erect strategies for zero trace camping and to have the tightest, smallest shell, absolutely minimal carbon quotients, the tiniest trace imaginable. And what a beautiful kind of discipline to learn how to minimize energy and to learn how to minimize our impacts. And yet, if that kind of trace continues the kind of same path of architecture that I've been taught, then it's very difficult to believe that merely making strong, minimal, tiny shelters has anything of the scale of renewal or engendering fertility or reaching out or transforming our world. Yes, we can achieve a 20% reduction in energy. Yes, we can efficiently use materials if we follow only a kind of minimizing sustainability. But what about transformation? What about creating fertility that can grow and reach and expand and hold. If I'm guided by the idioms that have taught me as an architect, then I might have a kind of an ethical purity of following Plato's maxims that would say envelopes are expensive. A sphere is the most beautiful, ideal form. It has the least possible surface, which is good. It has the greatest possible territory. That is a good thing. I wonder whether we could also see, however, in spite of the kind of beautiful purity and apparent moral rectitude of this series of kind of minimum surface forms, a kind of ugliness as well. Can you share that with me? Can you hate this raindrop? I think I do hate this raindrop. I hate it because it is a machine for resisting interaction with the world. There can be no more pure way of minimizing the exposing surface that would create my relationships. I think it's an architecture of death. Perfect for ballistics and of holding on to energy. But if my agenda is not retaining heat, but rather shedding heat and cooling and releasing and interacting, then surely such a form language as Plato taught us and the classical idioms of architecture have prevailed with us is something that at least needs to be questioned. I would much rather find a very different form language than the raindrop, such as the kind of maximum kind of reaction face that a snowdrop might offer. Frilly, excessive, fragile. The greatest possible potency in reaction and involvement and vulnerability and explicit, unapologetic fragility. This translates perhaps into a strategy for design in which reticulation and reaction face and potency replaces a set of Vitruvian paradigms, which are rather predicated on the firmitas, the permanence and maximum territory, which defines preceding realms of architecture. And perhaps this translates into an ethical system as well. At least a sensibility that we might have expanded physiologies in which we acutely feel the multiple octaves of presence that surround us, and that we might feel, in composite, a whole that we are a part of. Translating into a series of practical strategies, the kind of project that we see upstairs, I hope you'll join me upstairs, those kinds of sensibilities translate in the most practical terms in the weaving together of very, very lightweight structures, clothing them with interactive systems, crafting pore-like filters that can translate the environment through and set up convective loops of self-renewing and refreshment, weaving in rather faltering steps of synthetic biology that might turn into a kind of metabolism. And you can see the kind of grove-like column work structure here in the expanded diagrid meshworks that make up the pavilion upstairs, and the kind of certain emplacement of this march of structure under which we take shelter. These structures are saturated then with liquid manifolds that hold protocells, bedded in different viscosities of oil that allow aqueous vesicles to be held and seek renewal. And this produces a rather turbulent kind of fertile turf that replaces a preceding Vitruvian fabric of architecture with a new conception, a conception that architecture might be a kind of pluripotent soil. Clothing that physical craft is a quite dense skein of mechanisms which are crafted not so much to expand our territory, but rather resonate with it. Turbulence machines, dissipative figures that create bifurcations and that resonate with us and amplify our perceptions in very gentle ways. They're organized in multiple loops and nests and tribal interrelationships in terms of their intelligence systems. And underlying them is a set of algorithmic operations that tracks their behaviors. Some prescripted behaviors, like the reflexes that our doctors impart in looking at how our own legs and limbs behave in our nervous systems. Some occupancy mapping in determining where we are and where we stand and the different relationships of things. I'm speaking about the sensor arrays that then track our behaviors. And a new experiment, which is at work now, in which a curiosity-based learning algorithm replaces those prescripted behaviors. Curiosity-based software prioritizes shifts in learning and information, and that makes it quite disruptive. But in loops, this kind of behavior scripting does offer a tremendous interest, and the interweaving of those different software groups is something that we're now taking great heart in. I'll just show, to capture a feeling for how that behavior scripting works, a couple of little loops. And what you can see here, a little bit distinct from the last clip in which you saw the little frond works vibrating, is a curiosity-based algorithm here searching and measuring in proprioception. That is to say that each time it vibrates, there's an accelerometer and a space sensor and a light sensor, which is measuring what the machine is doing and feeding back and trying on other responses. Now, because my hand is still, it actually slowly gets bored because I'm not giving it more information. But if I cooperate and change my behavior, then the machine will experiment with different behaviors as well. Here you can just see the slight movements. They're very gentle. But I wonder if you can see in this, as I do, something similar to the motions of a baby colt just after it's born, slightly spastically learning to coordinate its limbs and trembling and very slowly and gently finding its coordination. Those kind of behaviors are ones that we tend to find in the operation of these softwares. Now, underlying this work is a certain belief in particular geometries, rather than the kind of crystalline, pure arrays that are so very compelling if we look at an ethical purity, but are so vulnerable to cracking. We're very interested in quasi-periodic arrays, non-repeating geometries which provide cross-linking and a very different kind of resilience, defining efficiency in different ways, defining it for adaptation and ability to cope with changing elements. There's an economy of individual links, such as these snap-fit chevrons, which link together into the duals of tetrahedrons, then multiply into corrugated digrids, using the embedded materials, that is, for example, the resilience of the acrylics that make up these sheet goods, in order to be able to avoid adhesives and hardware, and instead impart tensile forces into every single element. And this then weaves together into the kind of hyperbolic scaffolds that you see here, which have an extraordinary minimum of material and an ability to be resilient and to qualify as a kind of an architectural building material in the future. Woven on top of those kind of fabrics tend to be weed-like, turf-like amalgams and beds of protocells that impart humidity and start to make a breathing, quasi-living organic flux. And you can see just a little bit of details here. Here's one of the flasks that holds a protocell. We can look at it a little bit more closely here. It's being conditioned by shape memory alloys, which gather vibrations and pass convective plumes over it, and it's got a high power LED light to stimulate its growth, and it then is keyed into our own behaviors. The machinic environment likes us to be present because it acts as perturbation, and that stirs it and stimulates its growth. So we could be treated as something like food for the environment. And you can look a little bit closer in the glass flasks here, where some lovely osmotic reactions can be held in the vesicles within the oil flasks, such as this, which is a felt made of potassium ferric cyanide coming over a copper sulfate crystal. A little clip just so you could see that osmosis happening in a close-up. There's a lovely kind of blooming, very gentle reaction held in flasks right now, but hopefully it's qualifying as a kind of an ivy that might refresh the outside of buildings in the future. This work finally is founded on a sense of intimacy and touch, kind of a very close calibration of explicit fragility and delicacy expanding our bodies. And this translates into the making of cloth as well, questioning the kind of boundaries of architecture and seeing a kind of continuity between personal clothing and architecture and city making. These are some samples from a very happy ongoing collaboration with Iris van Herpen. Here's one early vibration-filled whisker dress. We don't claim that these are all sit-downable. To frame this work as a model of research and creation, just very briefly, starting with the kind of Vitruvian architecture that I've been complaining about, but I mean, you have to abuse your parents, right? So now crediting that with the enabling sanctuary that makes very delicate things possible in Genesis. The work starts then as rather delicate, unapologetically provisional and dependent layers inside, much like a petri dish makes it possible for participants to grow, or perhaps pockets in limestone make it possible for geodes to form. The strength and perhaps the confidence in those kinds of experiences makes it possible to project layers outside of buildings and start to engage public kind of forces as well. We built, for example, the solar decathlon house that came to the Washington Mall. That was an energy positive building that took on pretty good forces. The hope then, with those kind of dual movements inside and outside of stable structures, would be that it becomes possible to create perhaps a conception of Earth's surface machines making the ground and imparting fertility and resource positivity to environments, and also questioning the preceding scaffolds so that they can now dissolve, and so that there can be an internal resilience to the lightweight systems. And that hopefully then can start to address a sense of resonance in which the air and the weather and multiple octaves of material qualities might be able to be addressed. And that in turn then might offer a conception of architecture, hopefully a renewal of architecture, as a kind of pluripotent reticulum in which possibility might condense like soil. Let me sum up. I've complained about raindrops. And I've tried to persuade you that a form language based in fragility might offer some substance. I've tried to speak about alternate geometries that offer resilience. Some starting experiments seem to be very promising in reconceiving architecture as having a metabolism. And in turn, it seems to be possible to craft multiple tribal loops together into something which approaches consciousness, into crafting relationships that might be mutual, into a sense of emplacement which is not quite the same as commanding, not quite the same thing as having our bidding done, but offers a certain kind of resilience. And if there's a concentration in these first steps in personal anatomies and experiences, grounded in our own perceptions, then a hope would be that these might allow collective clusters to occur, not the kind of proud parades of the Washington Mall or Versailles, the kind of efflorescence of pure radial geometries, but perhaps the kind of clustering of tribal loops or village elders or the original Soviets or the Panchayat councils, clusters of friends and conversations which move into the sense of quite a resilient public. I've shared with you a rather solemn sense of ideation and realization. I don't think it's possible to simply proclaim optimism. But I do hope that these kind of examples of quite committed craft and collective research and creation do offer some sense of possibility that contributes. Thank you.